And now I would like to ask Dr. Alexander Nagel to come forward to introduce our guest speaker today. Alex holds an academic position with the State University of New York and with the Smithsonian Institution, and he's actively involved in research and publication of materials and archaeological sites in Iran and in Greece. And he's a longtime friend of the Kamran Seminar and also of our speaker as well. So Alex, would you like to come up?
Thank you, dear Anne and Sadia. Good morning, Sobecher. It is a great honor, a privilege for me to introduce today's speaker, and I'm sure that Farah would be very happy and very proud also of the speaker who's here today. This is the fourth time that we do this seminar, and I'm really honored every time also from the scholarly view here. The amount of speakers that are being brought here is amazing. So thank you really, Anne and Saria, for bringing Wouter here. Wouter, guten Morgen from Berlin. So Wouter is actually sharing at the moment time between Berlin in Germany and Paris, where he is an associate professor at the École Pratique Haute Études in Paris. He was born in Eindhoven, which is a small city in the Netherlands, and he studied in the 1990s at the universities of Utrecht and Leiden. One of his professors was the late Helen Sansisi Werdenborg, who I also recommend for her readings, actually, for anyone interested in ancient Iran. Wouter has been inspired, I think, by many trips to Iran, and he is also been between Iran and Tehran in Kermanshah, where he leads a project on Bisotun. Maybe you can talk about this also in your lecture today. He has been working most of all on some 30,000 tablets that were excavated in Persepolis in the 1930s, and he has become a great, tremendous inspiration for many students who are working now on Achaemenid Persia, and most important also on Elam, a culture of ancient Iran that he will also introduce to us this morning. He has published widely. One of the most important books, his dissertation, which he finished in 2006 at Leiden University, was published as a book. The Other Gods Who Are. It's about the religion in Persepolis based on these 30,000 tablets. I don't know if you studied all of them already, so these little tablets that are really a treasure also for what we know about ancient Persepolis and the people who lived there, the buildings that were created under Darius, Xerxes, and all of these leaders, and also about Zoroastrianism, and the religions that were in place in Persepolis at this time. So I'm going to keep it short. I would like to welcome you to the podium also, Wouter. Welcome back here to the Zoroastrian temple, and please give him a round.
Ladies and gentlemen, Alex already asked for a few words about the Bisotun inscription, so how could I fail not to start with that? The Bisotun inscription, made directly after the victory of King Darius around the years 520-519 BC in the region of Kermanshah, remains one of the key elements, one of the key monuments of ancient Iranian history and culture. If only because it was here that cuneiform writing was deciphered, and it was here that ancient Iran regained its voice in Old Persian writing, in Elamite writing, and in Akkadian writing. Bisotun was our gateway to ancient Iranian, especially Western ancient Iranian culture. The king who made this monument needs no introduction in this audience. It's Darius I, also known as Darius the Great. He is facing, on the relief of this monument, figure that in Iranian art history is nowadays called the figure in the winged disc, which is a very cautious and maybe overcautious description. As you may know, within the field of Achaemenid history, his interpretation is currently debated. Whatever position one takes, however, I will argue that his interpretation within a royal context and within the discourse founded by King Darius is a very specific one, and this is the angle that I'm going to take today. Now, if you look at the Bisotun monument, you will quickly realize that the monument has not been designed in one phase, but in several consecutive phases. First, there was only a relief, then King Darius chose to add an Elamite inscription to the right. Why Elamite? Elamite was the traditional language of writing in ancient Iran. And it was for that reason that the Persians also adopted Elamite. It was not a foreign thing for them, but it was part of their identity. Only later, the king added also an Old Persian and Babylonian version. The Old Persian version speaks for itself, of course, but the Babylonian version, I think it's important to remember, is also an Iranian thing, in the sense that Babylonian had been used, written and spoken in Western Iran, specifically in Khuzestan, for centuries before the Persians. Now, my question is, which I will present here for you, why King Darius chose this specific place? First of all, it is in a valley in Media, probably not far from the decisive victory that he had against his principal foe, Gaumata. If there was a real Gaumata, you may know that this is also disputed. But there is more to it. If you look at the relief and its placement, it's about the only surface on the rock of Mount Bisotun that is lit in the sunlight in late September, early October, which is the time of the final victory of King Darius. So it is a crucial orientation, I would say. Apart from that, the relief is situated in a gorge, and that gorge was already a sacred or numinous place in the time before Darius. Archaeologists were able to discover what they called a sacrificial platform, which was deep into the gorge at the bottom of this majestic mountain that rises over it. And here you can see the situation of the relief, which came later, and the sacrificial platform at the bottom. Still, questions remain. Why exactly here? Because, as I can testify, having worked on the spot for days and days, the stone on which the relief and the inscriptions are carved is not the most ideal spot on the rock of Bisotun. It is actually full of cracks and ancient stone errors. So why here? You just have to turn around if you stand in front of the relief and look at the other side. And there you see, running through the mountain, a break, a more or less horizontal break in the mountain. And water will pour out of this break in almost every position once it has started raining. This is also true for the position of the relief. Directly under the relief, water flows out of the rock. And if you now remember that the Bisotun monument was first designed as only a relief without inscriptions, it would have been a monument, a relief, sitting just on top of streams of water. And this, ladies and gentlemen, cannot be a coincidence. This sacred place was long related to the presence of water, the fertilizing water, which plays such an enormous role in Iranian culture. And here you can see the quite limited space in which the monument is placed. We are on the high scaffold that we built to study the relief, and you can imagine that if waterfalls are coming from all sides, this is a very special place. Water will stream over the rock, and the rock has been smoothened above and below the relief. If we now go back in time a little bit, I will try to show you what my chronological perspective is. What you see projected here is the heartland of the Achaemenid Empire, which more or less coincides with the current province of Fars in Iran. But in this province are monuments of an older date. monuments relating to the culture of Elam, a millennial state that existed in Khuzestan and Western Fars from at least 3000 BC. It left a number of open-air sanctuaries, notably those of Izer, Kulefara and Shekafte Salman, Kurangun and Naxxarustam. And of these I will pick one to make my point, the open-air sanctuary, the mountaintop sanctuary of Kurangun, exactly here where the arrow descends. Interesting parallel to start with if we compare it to Bizertun. Many tourists that come to Bizertun are amazed about the monument, but also about the fact that the mountain is so much higher than the monument. If you want, the makers of the Bizertun monument ascended a little bit to reach to the divine of the mountain, but the mountain remains majestic over it. Something similar is going on in Kurangun. The monument that I'm about to show this here is sitting on a hilly outcrop of the mountain, but it could have been made much higher. The mountain rises majestically over this. So it is almost as if there's a negotiation between the human and the divine. The human rises to reach to the divine, but the divine makes a much larger effort to reach to the human, and they reach each other on a low altitude of the mountain. Now, Korangun is a monument that was founded in the early 2nd millennium BC. That is almost 4,000 years ago. It has a central panel on which a divine couple is shown, a male and a female deity, and they are producing streams of water. You see here the male deity seated on his peculiar Elamite throne. And here you see the whole panel with a drawing projected on it to show you the different figures. I could also show you the little platform in front on which fish are carved. And that platform actually could be filled with water to make a pool through which probably processions took place. Water, anyhow, plays an important role here. Just directly below the relief, there's an ancient hole, a water hole from which a waterfall used to flow. So I guess that you understand that that parallel with Bizertun is remarkable and important. Water has always played a role in Iranian culture, life-giving, fertilizing water. Mountains always play a role, the way they rise up majestically in the Iranian landscape. Iran without mountains is not Iran. Water and mountains, it's crucial. And it is into this landscape that the Persians established themselves. So it is also no surprise that they would have taken on board elements from this ancient landscape. As always in Iranian history and culture, there is more continuity and more synthesis than abrupt change. Now, all of this serves for me as an introduction to the Persepolis Fortification Archive, the basis of my talk today. In this fortification archive, again, we find the veneration of mountains and water. And it is a text about barley, most of the texts are about barley, that is received by a magus, an Elamite that is Makush, and he divides this barley for 4 different sacrifices, meaning that he has been charged with the cults of 4 different cults. One is for the Lan sacrifice, which is a type of sacrifice that I will come back to. One is for the Mishebaka, which literally means all gods, a group of gods also attested in Vedic India. One is for Mount Aryaramnes, Aryaramna in Iranian, and of course also a member of the Achaemenid dynasty. It is the great-grandfather of Darius that has that same name. So here we already start to imagine, start to feel that mountains, also for the Achaemenid Persians, were very much part of their Persian identity and of their religious identity. If a member of the royal dynasty, maybe legendary member of the royal dynasty, has the same name as a mountain that is venerated, This must mean something. And then the last sacrifice is for or at a river, and there you go, there is the water veneration. Now, this Mount Arya Ramna is an interesting phenomenon because there's two of them. There's one in Fars, in ancient Parsa, referred to in the text that I just showed, but there's another one up in the north, in the Kermanshah region, which is mentioned in the 8th century BC, long before the Achaemenids, by an Assyrian king who tried to conquer parts of Iran, and during one of his military campaigns, came across this mountain and mentioned it in the annals of his campaign. So he mentions Mount Arya Ramni, which is Arya Ramnis. It's the same name. So I want you to reflect, if you will, for a while on this interesting duplication of the name. There's a Mount Arya Ramna in Media, and there's a Mount Arya Ramna in Fars. For me, this means that there is a kind of spiritual landscape, or a mental landscape, if you want. People project part of their legendary history, maybe part of their religious views, onto the landscape. They write onto the landscape. They transform the landscape by giving it these names and by worshipping it. And they do that in Media with the same name as they do later in Fars. This surely means something. This means that there is a common heritage that becomes visible in the 8th century BC, but also later under Darius in Achaemenid Fars. So I think we are starting to understand why these different sources together are so important. And now I will proceed to show you, or to try to convince you, why the fortification archive from Persepolis plays such a crucial role in this discussion. The fortification archive is so named simply because it was found in the fortification of Persepolis, in the northeastern sector of the platform, the Persepolis northeastern fortification. Here shown in an aerial photo from the 1930s, just after the excavation. And here again shown in a plan made by the excavator. It was actually not the purpose of the excavators to find tablets. As usual, it was a coincidence, and in this case it actually hindered their work. They wanted an access from the terrace because they were doing a very big operation, a very big excavation campaign, and they were removing tons and tons of debris from the terrace. And for this they had made a little system with trains and wagons that would remove the dirt from the terrace. And for this they needed to make an exit through the old fortification system. So the excavator Herzfeld ordered his deputy to do a very quick excavation here and then remove part of the wall so that they would have a ground level exit. And to their surprise and also a little bit to their irritation, they found in this system thousands and thousands of clay tablets. So for months they were busy doing that. Here you see the fortification system as it is today, and in the lower right you see a thin modern wall. That is where Herzfeld and his team removed the fortification wall and where they found the tablets. Unfortunately, Ernst Herzfeld was removed from the excavation not long after the discovery, and he never published a full report on the discovery, so that today we still don't know under what circumstances exactly the tablets were found. We only have this quite meager sketch of the fortification system which indicated where the tablets are found. They were then shipped in 1935 to Chicago, which was sponsoring Herzfeld's excavations, and they were given to a team of specialists charged with the publication of these tablets. Initially, this was a team of 4 people, George Cameron, Richard Hallock, and 2 others, but all of them left except for Richard Hallock. He persevered, and from 1937 onwards until his death in November 1980, he devoted all his days to working on these tablets. The tablets were found here, and they were found according to Herzfeld's archival notes in a place under a staircase, a small room or space that was walled off in antiquity, meaning that the tablets were deposited carefully and were meant to be preserved. So Hellock then worked on it from 1937 until his death in 1980, and I can express nothing but respect for the enormous devotion and energy that this unassuming man spent on working on the tablets. The tablets look like this. We call them tongue-shaped. This is a simple transaction, for instance, barley for workers, or wine for a sacrifice, or maybe travel rations for travelers coming from Bactria and going to Susa. All of that is counted and as a single transaction and recorded on a tablet that we usually call a memorandum, and they have this tongue shape. They are always sealed. The majority of them, I should say, is sealed, and seals are actually the first language in the archive. If administrators looked at a tablet, they would look at the seal impression first before reading the text. They can be very small, 1.5 centimeters sometimes. They can be much bigger. We have even tablets approaching 30 centimeters, among the biggest ones that we have from the ancient world. They have beautiful seal impressions, and you know from my colleague, esteemed colleague Mark Garrison, how important these seal impressions are. They add enormously to the iconography of Achaemenid Persia, and they add enormously to our knowledge of the religious landscape of ancient Fars. They are, for the moment, and for the larger part, still in Chicago. And until now, we have established that there is about 8,000 of them that are written in Elamite that are well enough preserved to be meaningful for study. Apart from that, as Alex already said, there's tens of thousands smaller fragments that are very difficult to read. We also have about 800 tablets written in Aramaic, so the archive was multilingual, and we have about 5,000 tablets that only have seal impressions, stressing the fact that seals are very important, are a language of their own within this archive. By the way, for those of you unfamiliar with the term Elamite, as I said, Elamite was the language of the old kingdom of Elam in southwestern Iran, and Elamite is unaffiliated. It doesn't have any other language that it is related to, making the study of Elamite particularly difficult, and this is probably why it has taken so long for this material to come out. As you know, since you have met the great leader of our project, Matthew Stolper, this is an international and interdisciplinary project. It is directed by Matthew Stolper of the University of Chicago, but it also has, besides him, Annalisa Azzoni for the Aramaic, and Elspeth Dusenberry and Mark Garrison for seals, and with myself as second editor of the Elamite. We are preparing currently not only the publication of the entire archive, the Elamite and Aramaic text, and the seal impressions, but we are also preparing for the return of the tablets to Iran. Iran generously loaned the tablets for 50 years to Chicago, a loan that expired in 1985, so we are long overdue in returning the tablets. You may also have heard about the legal proceedings surrounding the tablets for a long time that have luckily ended with a judgment by the US Supreme Court. So we're now preparing for the return of the tablets. And let me just say a few words about that. For me personally, and for us in Chicago, and for everybody who is involved in this, also the people in the National Museum of Iran in Tehran, it is very clear that the return of the tablets is not going to be the return of clay objects. It is going to be the return of a new idea about ancient Iran. It is going to be the initiation of a new generation of scholars working on the Achaemenid Empire and the Achaemenid heartland and everything that is connected to it. For us, this is an intellectual enterprise, and we are very proud to share this intellectual enterprise with our Iranian colleagues, and I'm personally very, very gratified that I have very good students in Tehran and also Iranian students that work with me in Berlin and in Paris that will take over the torch and continue the work on these tablets. And I have nothing but appreciation for the investment of Dr. Jebrail Nokhandeh, the current director of the National Museum of Iran, in not only preparing all the facilities, really state-of-the-art facilities for hosting the tablets, but also allowing students to work on them and doing everything possible to make sure that this intellectual endeavor that we have in mind will be a great success. So we have tongue-shaped tablets, some of them written in Aramaic, as I said. Some of them are written in Elamite and they have Aramaic written on top of it. So suggesting an interchange between people reading and writing Elamite and those reading and writing Aramaic. And we have reason to believe that all these people spoke Persian, so that some of them were trilingual. They spoke Persian, but they could handle written Elamite and written Aramaic. So just imagine that. Then we have these beautiful seal impressions. I'll give you just one example. And some of them we can relate to historical people, like Gobryas, who was one of the fellow conspirators of Darius the Great. We have religious scenes, and I believe that Mark Gerson already talked about them, that change our view on Achaemenid religion. It is a vast operation. The territory I projected here again is as big as modern-day Switzerland, and comparable also in how it is structured. It has valleys and plains between the mountains that are directly controlled by the central institution in Persepolis, but it also has higher altitudes used for pastoralism, where central control is not as strong as it is in the valleys, and different types of economies that are associated with these different zones. It is geographically very wide, and it is thematically very varied. For instance, it tells us about textile production, which was by and large in the hands of women. And these women had their own teams, and when they were the head of such a team, they had high salaries, and they were relatively independent within their own working group. So this is, of course, a different subject, but I just wanted to introduce it to you briefly because I find it always very captivating. Here is a text. It's a so-called letter order, and in it, a certain Ethiopia is spoken to by Parnaka. Parnaka is the big director of the archive, and the order is about livestock to be given to women, and these women are chiefs of the Pashab women. Pashab are weavers or textile makers of some kind, under the responsible of yet another person, a certain Irshena, as rations. And then they are named. They are named. These people that would normally remain anonymous in history, they are named. And these were people with not extremely high positions, but still within their own working context, good positions. They had enviable positions, and they received livestock, which was not for every worker. And as I said, they are known to us by name. This is part of what the archive does. It really brings these people to life, and it shows us what is happening in relatively low areas of the social hierarchy. Now, these tablets that I'm talking about, they were written all over Fars, but they were found in Persepolis. How is that possible? The solution to that is this little tablet, which is not tongue-shaped. It's flat, it's round, and it has impressions of textile and strings on its back. So it closed something. It closed a bag. And it says something. It says these tablets are those of the fruit of the place Mandakurda in the 23rd year, that is the 23rd year of Darius, allocations by Hisatia. Meaning that there was a bag or another container in which there were tablets, that bag was closed, and on top of the knot on the bag, this tablet was placed, and a small, short description was written onto it for the archive in Persepolis. So this bag must have been closed locally and then sent to Persepolis. So in a place in the western part of this area, you can imagine a writer, a scribe, was making tablets. Then a person from Persepolis would stop by, put everything in a bag, close it, and send it to Persepolis, where it would be controlled and processed. It would be processed into a so-called register or journal, which summarizes these smaller tablets, And those then would be processed into yet another category, that of the accounts, so that you would rise to a higher and higher level, and at the end, the directors of the archive would have a good survey of what was going on. The territory was dissected by royal roads, one descending from the Caspian area and Ekbatana via Esfahan all the way to the Persian Gulf, and another one that was coming from Anatolia, from Sardis, that crossed Mesopotamia, entered Iran west of Susa, went around Khuzestan, then into the mountains to the Persepolis area, and from there all the way to India. Incredible distances. And any governor, any satrap in Anatolia could give a travel authorization to any individual to travel all the way to India, and this person would be safe and would receive travel rations every day and would find a travel stop where he could spend the night every day throughout the empire. And not only that, but the central authorities knew where he was at which points. And they could, at the end of his journey, see all his expenses. Try to do that today, I always suggest. So, dissected by roads and divided into 3 areas. I won't go into the details of that. I just want to show you, again, to show the chronological background of this. These areas, they have regional or area directors, and they, again, are recognizable by the seals they use. So this remarkable seal that you see here, which has a Neo-Elamite inscription, it's actually a bit older than the time of Darius. It's a so-called Neo-Elamite seal. It is used by Irshena, who has a Persian name, Irshina, who was a very important Persian, probably noble of a very high rank, a person that people would recognize if they saw him. But he uses a seal that belonged originally to somebody else, to an Elamite predecessor. And the name of the Elamite predecessor is on this seal. And this is not because Irshena has stolen this seal, but because this seal was prestigious. Elamite culture was prestigious for the early Persians. And they would, especially noble Persians, liked to have these older seals and use them to show their status and their connection with history. This is also true within the royal family. This is a letter, and it is about animals given to Queen Irtashtuna. Irtashtuna herself, as we will see later, had a very specific seal with Assyrian elements in it. Now that we're talking about the queens, again, women in ancient Iran is a very fascinating subject, also when it comes to the queens. The tendency has been for a long time to read such texts as individual statements. For instance, here, the queen receives a number of animals, and it has been related to a party that she organized for Nowruz. This, however, if you have ever prepared for Nowruz, is something that can be dismissed immediately, because if you do prepare for Nowruz, you do it in the 12th month, and you do not give animals in the 1st month, because then you're too late for the party. So that doesn't work. But more particularly, that interpretation, I think, is too personal. What we're looking at is an economic system, a state-run economic system, and we should not try to impose our personal stories on it. Having said so, and I apologize for the small lettering, there is, of course, history in this. For the queen that is mentioned here, Irtashtuna, was a daughter of Cyrus the Great. She was one of 2 daughters of Cyrus the Great, together with her sister or half-sister Atusa, that married Darius the Great when he rose to power. And this was, of course, a measure taken by Darius to cut off any possible descendant of Cyrus that could challenge his reign. So it was a very wise measure of him to marry these 2 women. That doesn't mean, however, that they were curfewed or being imprisoned in court. We find both women, but especially Irtashtuna, in full power. They have their own economic house. They travel separately. They have their own entourage of servants. They have their own scribes. They write letters about their own estates with complicated orders referring to Aramaic and to Elamite documents. So this, of course, as you may imagine, challenges a lot of what we think we know about ancient Persia. So, coming to speak about what we think we know about ancient Persia, one of the things that we think we know, because Herodotus told us so, is that the Persians had no temples, no statues, and no altars. Herodotus tells us so very explicitly, and it must be true because Herodotus is the father of history. End of the discussion. Now, this is exactly why I organized with my colleagues Jean Kellens of the Collège de France and Céline Redard a conference on the current state of knowledge of Achaemenid religion, gathering all the specialists on this particular subject and discussing, among other things, this particular passage from Herodotus. It's actually very easy to put something against it from the archive. Here you see almost 10,000 liters of wine being given for a temple, the Elamite word is Zion, at Hakurtish. The word that is interpreted here as temple is transparent. There is no doubt about it. We have hundreds of older Elamite inscriptions from the 2nd millennium that use the same word, Zion, to describe excavated buildings that are temples, architectural temples with altars and a cellar and everything. So the word is clear. It may have had a different meaning, of course, in Achaemenid context, but the word as such is clear, there's no doubt about it. But for me as a historian, actually, the 10,000 liters of wine is more important because it makes me aware of the fact that this temple was not only a place of worship, but it was also an economic institution. Otherwise, it wouldn't need such an enormous amount of wine. Now, the interesting thing is that this temple is only mentioned here. And this, again, for me as a historian, is a very interesting fact. When, on the one hand, it's so important that it receives this massive quantity of wine, which is expensive, of course, and on the other hand, it is relatively invisible in the archive, it means that it must have been quite autonomous. And therefore, it is not visible in the centralized state archive. Let me go on, because this word Zion, temple, occurs more often. I assume that you cannot read this, so I have enlarged part of it. It's another letter order. It's about livestock that has to be issued to a certain Bakabata and Apimena. The reading of the name is not entirely certain. And they are serving at, or making, or producing, or working at, I would say, the temple of the sacrificial table at the Shuma of Cambyses and the woman Upandush at Naretsas. That's a whole lot of new things together, and this is actually a very recent reading of this text. Let me start step by step. Temple is Zion in Elamite. In traditional Elamite, as I said, it is a real temple, maybe in this context a little bit different. Then, sacrificial table. The word in Elamite is bashuru. It's actually a word that comes from Akkadian. It is entirely certain that it is a sacrificial table, a table on which you make sacrifices, maybe a kind of altar. So you have a temple, and in it you have a sacrificial implement. And this is connected to the Shumar of Cambyses, and Shumar is a funerary monument. It's a tomb or a grave or something like that. And Cambyses is Cambyses, it's Cambodia. So although Cambyses is not very celebrated in the inscriptions of Darius, he is still a Persian king, and he deserves funerary sacrifices, and in the reign of Darius we find that in the tablets. Also his wife Upandush is mentioned, and this Upandush, yes, there she is actually the same that we know from the Greek sources as Phaidume or Phaidumia. It's a Greek popular etymology actually that is working here. So we have Cambyses, the king, and his wife, there's no doubt about it, and their funerary monument is in Naretsas, and Naretsas is the Elamite writing of the name of what is now Neris in eastern Fars. So the tomb of Cambyses is in Neris. You can now go there and try to find it, and you will become very famous. So entirely new. Funerary sacrifices, a kind of temple, a sacrificial table in it, a funerary cult. These sacrifices are not mentioned here only. The sacrificial table occurs in a number of documents, but let me skip that and go to the archaeology. In Persepolis and also in Akhirustan, we have the tombs of the Achaemenid kings, those in Persepolis being a little bit later than those in Naxxurustan, and those in Persepolis being the object of excavation campaigns by Ali Sami, who started working in Persepolis after the American campaign stopped. And in front of one of these tombs, he found actually two spaces that he describes as square rooms. Maybe you could actually define them as a small temple. And in one of these rooms, one of these spaces, he found a square slab of stone with around the edge a little gutter freezed into the stone, which according to Sami, and I tend to agree with him, was meant to let the liquid from the sacrifice, be it wine or being the blood of the animals, escape from the stone. And of course, all of this was built directly in front of the royal tombs, so that we have the same setup that we find in the tablets. We have a funerary monument, a shumar. We have something that you might call a temple, a sion, and in that temple you have a sacrificial table, a bashur. So this shows how nicely archaeology and text can work together. Now, of course, I became interested in Near East because of the tablets about Cambyses. Here you can see it on the map. So I went there recently, past the beautiful salt lakes and the quite captivating landscape of Eastern Fars towards the valley of Near East. So I hope you can see it. It is still, the mountains around Near East are a lush landscape. It is a national park where ibexes live, where the last wild panthers of Iran live, and most importantly, where the last wild donkeys of Iran live. And the donkey hunt was something which, in the Achaemenid period, was something very important. Now, we don't have surveys or archaeological campaigns in Near East yet, but we are starting to organize that. It is certainly very important as a place, and very interesting historically, if only because the old Friday Mosque of Near East actually is an old Sasanian building. It has been interpreted as a temple, but it might actually be a palace. And it's a very important indication, of course, for the crucial position and significance of Near East. Another element I just want to mention briefly, I was talking about Naxxurustan. There's a lot of possibility because the site has never been excavated completely, and as you can see, it's still partly covered by sand. And as I understood from Dr. Talebian, the head of the Cultural Heritage Organization in Iran, the Iranians are now looking into reopening the excavations of Naxxurustan. That would be very interesting. And I have suggested to him also to do a survey of the top of the Kur Hossein, which is the mountain of Naxxurustan, because there's cultic installations on top of it. And of course, we would like to know how they relate to the royal tombs. Is it the same as in Persepolis, or is it different? So there's a lot of work to be done still. So text and archaeology, text of different kinds. I was working from the Elamite tablets. I think that's also correct, because they're primary sources from the heartlands. But now that we have them and that we have connected them with the archaeology, we can also connect them with some of the Greek sources. And the Greek sources indeed talk about another tomb, that of Kurush or Cyrus the Great. And this was, as you know, situated in Pasargad. And he actually says that it had a guard of magi, and that they had a little house. Sometimes it's translated as canteen, which I find very funny. And they were receiving animals. They were receiving animals for their own maintenance and for sacrifice. Now that we have the Persepolis tablets, we can understand this much better, because in the tablets we read often that these animals and other commodities given for the gods are afterwards consumed by the priests. They have a double function. Don't forget that we are in an economic context. They are given to the gods, but they also serve as a basis of income for the priests. So the magi guarding the tomb, they will make sacrifices with it, but they will also consume it. Now, the tomb of Cyrus, here before the British campaigns, has a long cultural history. Unfortunately, the area around it has been egalized in the 70s. But on old pictures, you can see that it was surrounded by a number of buildings. Some of them are early Islamic, but some of them date to the time of the Achaemenids. So it is well possible to find, perhaps one day, the building which you could describe as the temple of the sacrificial table of the tomb of Cyrus. So funerary sacrifices, that's just one dossier where you can see that you can really move beyond what Herodotus tells us about Achaemenid religion. But let's go further. I want to hammer a little bit on this aspect of temple. And read with me. 220 liters of vinegar was acquired, and it is delivered by Omitra at the temple, again the word Sion, in order for that extra vinegar to be deposited on the account of Dadatuka of Zarnamia. Now, my interest here is not in the first place temple, but the name Zarnamia, which is a place. It's a place name. So there is a temple in a place called Zarnamia. This must be somewhere on the road to Media. So, in Zarnamia, we have the cult of a god who in Elamite is known as Zarnamar, and you probably have to understand that as Zarnava. Yeah? Now, a question, of course, who is this god Zarnava who has a temple? That is, of course, very interesting. Well, Zarnava is if you know Iranian, it's a very easy derivative. It means the golden one. Yeah? So you have a god called Zarnava, the golden one, and the place name Zarnavia is of course derived in turn from Zarnava. It means the place of the golden one. So the place, the village or the town called Zarnavia is named after the god that is venerated there. But that doesn't answer the question, what is Zarnava? What kind of god is this? I don't have a definitive answer, and I will be very open to suggestions from you and for discussing about it. One thing that I can tell you is that in various traditions, Anaita was called the golden one, or was associated with golden decorations, golden jewelry, golden crowns and necklaces and so forth. So it might actually be an epithet of Anaita, it might also be an epithet of another god, and it might also be a totally unknown god. I think we should be open to all these possibilities. Now, as for statues, if somebody is golden, this has often been said about the description of Anaita, it means that you imagine that deity in a human form, and that you can imagine even a statue of it. Of course, this has been much disputed. Why? Because Herodotus, the father of history, tells us that the Persians don't have statues. And I just repeat what I assume Mark Garrison has told you when he visited here. The seals tell a different story. They show you images of deities or semi-deities, and some of them are clearly recognizable as statues. For instance, when you put a figure on a little podium like this, in iconographic terms, that means it's a statue. And it is venerated by these two creatures, the goat fish and the fish human on the left and on the right, which, by the way, are symbols that were already current in Elamite religion. This is an Assyrianizing image. The four-winged geniuses, left and right, are coming from Assyrian iconography, yet the way they are rendered is very Persian. And the person in the middle looks like either the manifestation of a god or the statue of a god. This is the seal that I mentioned before of Queen Etashtuna, and again you see a very rich plethora of sacred elements that are being connected here. But let me go a little bit faster because I don't want to spend too much time on this particular aspect. And I will now go back to my main question about the religion of the Achaemenids. There has been a long time that people wrote books about the religions of Iran, and they would not mention the word Elam or Elamite. And I think this is a mistake. I think we should really see the millennial history of Iran as it is, with all its richness and with all the traditions that come together. For if there's anything essential in Iranian culture and Iranian history through all these centuries, then it is the ability to synthesize. Iranians have always been able to make a new synthesis and a new start from old elements. And I think that the Elamite past is part of that, and this actually has already been recognized by George Cameron, who wrote a history of ancient Iran that started in the Elamite period. Right. So with that perspective, I try to look afresh at some of the tablets from Persepolis. For instance, here a delivery of barley for a priest called Ururu, and you see that he used it for 4 different purposes. One for the old Mesopotamian god Adat, a storm god, who was venerated in Elam and later also by the Persians. One for a kushukum offering. A kushukum is, the word kushukum is probably related to our word kiosk. And it is an open temple, maybe comparable to an Ateshgade, and it was the place of sacrifices, of animal sacrifices in pre-Achaemenid Iran. 2 for a tikrakash offering. A tikrakash is a storage place with a pointed roof, probably for grain. And they made sacrifices at such places to implore the protection of the grain. So this is connected to the agricultural circle. And 2 for a reservoir, a water reservoir. And water, we said it at the beginning, is of absolute essence in Iran. Water is life-bringing, so of course you would sacrifice to water. So is this now Elamite religion because Adat is mentioned, or because the name of the priest Uru is an Elamite name? Is this Indo-Iranian religion? Is this Zoroastrianism? To be honest, I would defer passing a judgment on this and say this is Persian religion. Persian in the sense that it is a synthesis of older elements. And I wouldn't press one particular tradition right now. This is my perspective on the archive. And let me try to show that with a few more elements. These are the most current types of sacrifices. Some are known by the deities connected to these sacrifices. Some are known by a technical term for a particular kind of sacrifice. All of them have numbers behind them, which is the total value in grain of all the attestations that I have in the archive. Yeah, so this is basically a list of importance. You see that the land sacrifice at the beginning is well attested and has the most commodities. It is followed by these funerary sacrifices for Bashur and Shumar, also Ship, which is a very big royal feast. And then the first named god, the first important named god is Humban, not an Indo-Iranian god, not a god known in the Zoroastrian tradition, an old Elamite god, but a royal god. And because of his status as a royal god, important for the Achaemenid kings, and because he had always been worshipped in Fars, also worshipped in the Persian periods. There is no animosity between the older and the new gods. The Persians were very pragmatic and open, and they included all these gods in their heartland pantheon. So blue are gods with an Elamite background, red are gods with an Iranian background, and green are those for which we really cannot say if they're Elamite or Iranian. Here again you see a delivery of barley. It is received by a person with the title Makush, and he uses it for different gods, one of whom is Shetrabatish. This actually is not, as used to be thought, an epithet of Aramazda, but it is a god who also exists in Vedic India and who is connected to the fertility of the fields. And he is prayed to, he is invoked when plowing the fields. So this particular example shows you what kind of context we're in. First of all, we are in a society where agriculture is everything and fertility is everything. When 1 year the harvest is bad, the whole society suffers terribly, really terribly. The whole institution with all its tablets, with all its fortresses and road stations and horses and royal people and whatever, crucially depends on agriculture. Agriculture is at the forefront of their thoughts. So religion is also geared towards fertility, towards agriculture. So gods that are close to the fertility of the fields, to the success of plowing, for instance, such as this Chhatrapatish, are marked in the archive. So maybe this doesn't answer the questions that we want to pose. Maybe it doesn't tell us exactly, it doesn't answer us the question if the Achaemenids were Zoroastrians in the way we understand it or something else, but it tells you something about the importance of religion in everyday life. It was very close. And another thing that it tells us is that the connection with ancient India as the connection with ancient Elam is very important. All of that is a synthesis. So one of the elements that I mention here in the first text is a sacrifice for Mariraj, which is Iranian Huarira for sunrise. There you could make the case for an Iranian background, but again, just to confuse you, look at this. This is the model of a sacrifice taking place in the early morning. It has an Elamite inscription, and it says that it is a Sit Shamshi ritual, which means the ritual of sunrise, and it was made in the 12th century BC by King Shilhak in Shushanak of Elam. And it was found in Susa, in one of the main temples there. And here you see a smaller image of the two priests that are handing each other a sacred object during their morning ritual. So sunrise rituals exist in Iran, like water rituals and mountain rituals. I don't think that we necessarily have to choose one particular strain of tradition. I think we should stress that the Achaemenids are the great heirs of all this richness in tradition. They are the ones that make a new synthesis, and I think, if anything at all, that this is the importance of the Achaemenids for the history of Zoroastrianism. Thank you. Thank you so much.